This is the beginning of podcast number 15, the second one on Chapter 12, Assessing Student Learning. Some successful alternative assessments, some steps for teachers to use are you need to decide on the standard or learning goal before you start to create the assessment. In other words, you need to look at your objectives, look at the behavioral verbs of the objectives, and those usually will tell you exactly what type of assessment you need to use and which domain it's in. Second thing is you need to decide on the content or the learning tasks that will be learned. You need to establish performance outcomes, in other words, benchmarks like in the South Carolina standard or benchmark 1.1, 1.1, 2.3, and so on. Fourth step is to select and develop the assessment methods. Those are based again on the behavioral verbs. Some verbs that are examples are dribble, analyze, create, identify, perform, cooperate, and encourage. If you listen to any of those verbs, you can kind of categorize them into the three learning domains. The fifth step is to select appropriate instructional progressions to teach the students the content that you want to assess them on. Teach the tasks, focusing on maximum practice and feedback. The seventh step is to use assessment strategies developed that we talked about in step 4 on the last slide. And the last step is to use the assessment results to help students self-correct, give them feedback, evaluate student learning, improve instruction, your own instruction, and to refine learning goals. You can use that data to refine the learning goals for the next lesson plans that you use. The age-old question in education is, what has been learned? You can use informal assessments, challenges like you see in your book in the Graham Holt Hale Parker textbook, and they're instructional tasks which are in reality informal assessments to find out what students can and cannot do. You can also have checks for understanding where you ask children questions to show their understanding of a particular aspect of the lesson that has been taught, or ask them to demonstrate in some way. Informal assessments are assessments that we don't actually write data down for, or we don't score it, or we don't document learning in some way. Informal assessments are just to see what's happening with the students. An informal assessment also is something like show your thumbs up if you understand, thumbs down if you don't. That's not a formal assessment that we can gather data on. Some formal assessment options that we'll show on the next 10 or 11 slides are teacher observation with a checklist, which makes it formal, exit or entrance slips to the class where you write down a few, ask the students to write down something about cognitive or psychomotor things or affective things, student journals, which are affective, homework assignments that could be motor or cognitive, peer observations, self-assessments, event tasks, which we'll talk about in a minute, videotape or digital pictures, student drawings, which become they're very helpful in a pre-K class or younger elementary school classes, student displays like bulletin boards and so on, which are not used quite as much in physical education, or student portfolios. Teacher observation is the most common form of assessment in physical education, but it's also the one that's the most abused. In other words, we need a checklist to be able to document things as we observe the students and their responses to our tasks. Unless you have a checklist, it's hard to keep up with what you're seeing and with students' progress along the way. It's generally used to assess psychomotor performance, but sometimes also the affective domain. Many tools are used for recording observational information, and a whole class checklist is the most common. The next type of formal assessment is an exit or an entrance slip. Usually it's done as an exit slip at the end of the class. It is more for the cognitive and or affective domains. It can be done in just a few minutes during or at the end of class, usually at the end because it's easier to write things at the end when you've gathered the students together. It's designed to assess cognitive and affective goals, as I said before. There's an example of an exit slip in the picture on this particular slide. You could have something called a 30-second wonder where they write down all the things they can remember that they learned that particular day in class in 30 seconds. Or it could be a 3-minute paper as an exit slip where they recall or they answer questions and so on. It might be a demonstration by students and they write down the critical elements after seeing the demonstration. Those kinds of things are all formal assessments. Student journals are written records of participation, results, responses, feelings, perceptions, reflections about what actually happened. They're very much like diaries where students write honestly and freely. They're designed to assess the affective domain and nothing else. And there's another picture on this slide that shows you the cover of the journal for a student in a physical education class. Usually the journals are done over a period of time. It could be once a week for an entire grading period, 9-week or 6-week grading period. It could be every day of the week if they have physical education then. It could be once or twice a week. But anyway, when you design these student journals, you need to keep in mind that you need to give them prompts for the journals or things that will guide their answers or their journal writing along the way. It's important to remember that with younger kids, particularly pre-K and K, because they can't write very well, it's not exactly an appropriate assessment for them. But even upper elementary, with younger kids, it does take longer to do these student journals because they don't write very fast. So that's important to remember. Also remember that when you're assessing the affective domain, you're looking for honesty. You don't want to grade these journals. You want them to feel safe about what they put in the journal. And the other thing is you need to read the journals after they take the time to write and give you answers to prompts and so on. It's the feedback to the teacher that's important. Homework assignments are another formal assessment. They're done outside the physical education class and usually done for the motor or cognitive domains. It's great for outside reading, keeping personal records, or other written work. It's used to practice psychomotor skills and enhance cognitive understanding. Many times you have to ask the parents to verify whether the students have done the motor skills or the cognitive assignments that you've given as homework. But it is important to have that possibility for them to verify the homework. Yes, some of you will say, well, what if the parents sign the form and they don't do the homework, and the parents say that they did? Well, they're not really hurting anybody but themselves because they're not getting the homework, they're not getting the cognitive concepts outside of class, they're not getting to practice the motor skills that they need to, and therefore they're not going to do well on other assessments either. Another type of formal assessment is peer observation, or what we usually call peer assessment. Students are observing other students and the partner provides feedback to the performer. In both of these pictures you can see actually one of them is using an iPad and one of them has a clipboard, but they're observing their friends or their classmates in physical education class and they're going to give them some feedback or help them debrief afterwards about the skills that they were practicing. It's used to assess competence and skill performance and demonstration of selected critical elements. Again, for this type of assessment, no grading for peer assessments is probably a good idea. They're using this as a formative assessment. Even though it's formal, we do want them to get that feedback from their partner. The partner must know the critical elements of the skills that they're practicing ahead of time, so they should have a rubric to look at. And they also want to help the partner, and helping that partner gives them some responsibility, helps them concentrate on the cues and the critical elements themselves, and a picture of someone else doing the skill or the performance is worth 1,000 words. Sometimes it's a lot easier for students to learn about how to do a physical skill if they watch somebody else do it. This is the end of podcast number 15 for Chapter 12.